Hello and welcome back to another edition of WTFGAS Podcast. Today we'll be considering 30 Drunken Peasants Antagonists. So for me, the Drunken Peasants Podcast was a fairly important part of my life for especially the first 4 years of its run from 2014 to 2018. During that time, especially in 2015, I was spending a lot of time at my computer doing readings for my general's exams. So while I was going through some of these theory-based, sometimes extremely boring readings, I was able to get by with the entertainment provided by TJ, Scotty, Paul, and Ben. And I still watch on occasion, even though the show is not what it used to be. But a lot of what made the show work so well was that they had a really rich cast of antagonists. And while this is not a comprehensive list of every antagonist they've ever faced, and there were a few people I wasn't sure how to categorize, I have chosen 30 people who I think are fairly representative, especially the show's first 4 years, and then a few people who have been the stars since it just became the Ben and Billy show. Well, it's still called Drunken Peasants, but it's only got 2 hosts now. So anyhow, without any further ado, let's jump in and look at some of the major antagonists who have been featured on Drunken Peasants since 2014. So first of all, we have Anita Fuentes. Anita was a kind of evangelical from New York. She was involved in a family ministry, went through a high-profile divorce, which was supposed to be against her beliefs. What's interesting about her is that she is much more charismatic and attractive, frankly, than most of the people that DP messes with. I don't know how she got into the life that she's in. Apparently she was a stripper at one point. She's pretty interesting, but because she never clapped back against DP, there was never enough drama or a kind of saga there. She just would make outrageous claims, and then there were some details about her personal life that were rather interesting. But for the most part, while she was an interesting person to feature on occasion, she was not really a very compelling antagonist in the end. She had a lot of potential, but ultimately, I feel like it was a little bit underdeveloped. I'm going to put her in the D tier. Next up, we have the Toothless Wonder himself, Von Helton. Von Helton, if I'm not mistaken, is a young Earth creationist. Sometimes when it comes to the religious antagonist of DP, I get a few of their views confused. I know most of them are young Earthers, not all of them though. I'm pretty sure he's one. And I remember there was a clip that they showed one time, or maybe it was just Paul describing it, where Von Helton was dressed up like a cowboy, and he was toothlessly explaining how he was fighting against evil. They also showed plenty of clips, and he still appears once in a while. There's another famous hangout where he and Brett Keane are talking about how great it is to not have teeth, and Von Helton says something to the effect of, you don't have to worry about how much ice cream you eat because you can't get a headache without teeth. He seems like a fairly nice guy in many ways, and he's crazy, but he seems like a decent guy. And he doesn't feature all that prominently in DP. He's not a frequent villain. But when he does appear, he's always entertaining because of his bizarre views. That being said, he's never been a major feature, and he's more or less kind of an unofficial member of the Brett Keane posse. He wasn't with him during some of the great debates in the early days of the show, but he is part of that circle. But he kind of has his own thing going. And because he's not a complete piece of shit, he doesn't quite get the kind of coverage that someone like Brett gets. Nonetheless, I think Von Helton, respectable but nothing special. There's never been a saga or anything with Von Helton. He's a C in terms of his role as a Drunken Peasants villain. Next up, we have Chris Anderson, a.k.a. Fake Sagan, a.k.a. Hardcase Olms, a.k.a. Smooth Terrorist. So I remember in the old days of YouTube atheism, I used to watch some of those videos when I was an undergrad. I never really got that into Fake Sagan, but I did know who he was, just like how I knew who Brett Keane was. I also knew about TJ, and I watched a fair number of his videos. I was not a huge fan, but I was, I guess, a fan. With these other guys, Captain Awesome, whoever else was around, I did know about them and watch their videos on occasion, and I was in the new atheism, broadly speaking, but I was never super into it. So I knew who this guy was, and then I remember seeing that one video where he held a gun to TJ's head on the live stream hangout from that one site that has become defunct now. Chris Anderson has had a limited run on DP, but still a pretty good one. So he came out of obscurity after the gun incident, and it turns out that he's now an Orthodox Christian who has a beard that's supposed to look like Rasputin or a priest, I guess. And he has gone through a bunch of changes. He's completely changed his worldview. I also remember his little run as the smooth terrorist. I really liked that animation he had where the plane would bounce off the building. By then he was like a libertarian right-winger, but not necessarily religious. So he changed his views a lot. And he's entertaining in a lot of ways. He also sided with Brett for a while to try to own DP and then turned against Brett. Now, it's based on limited exposure, so it's hard to rank him too highly, but I still have to go with at least a B, just because this guy is entertaining, and psychologically he is a fairly interesting and somewhat complex character. Next up we have Venom Fang X, and much like Chris Anderson, this is someone who goes back to those early days of the atheist community fighting against Christians on YouTube. Venom Fang X, however, was a creationist and the whole 9 yards. And so Venom Fang X is the kind of guy who was always on the other side of the issue. Now, I did not watch a whole hell of a lot of his videos, but I did know who he was. I also remember the big controversy with Thunderfoot, and I remember that being covered, and how he had to leave YouTube, and then he came back and did sort of an interview with DP. He seems like a fairly civil guy, at least after he effectively got shut down by Thunderfoot on threat of a lawsuit. That being said, I actually find him to be very boring, and that episode where he appeared was a little bit of a slog, and it was interesting just to get a little bit of insight into who this guy was, and it certainly saved me the agony of actually having to watch his videos. But he's basically just a generic apologist who just doesn't really have any good arguments and relied a lot on controversy and character assassination. I got to go with an F. I never found this guy compelling, and I'm glad he only featured a little bit. I don't think anything would have been gained by featuring him more. The only funny thing about his appearance on that one episode is that one of his conditions is that there can be no profanity. So every time we take a break, TJ would go on this long rant of saying like, fuck, son of a bitch, cunt, goddamn, you know. So he'd just do that while Venom Fang X was gone. But other than that, that episode was rough because VFX is not an interesting guy. Next up, we have perhaps the most verbose of the Drunken Peasants villains, and that would be Stefan Molyneux. Stefan is a right-wing conservative philosopher in the loosest sense of the word. I guess you could call him an intellectual insofar as he makes his living based on his ability to think and speak. But effectively, his only real skill is taking 2 minutes worth of ideas and taking an hour to say those things. He pontificates in a way that is amazing in its ability to fill dead air without really saying all that much. He also, now that I think about it, looks a whole lot like Jim Cramer. He's sort of like maybe the movie version of Jim Cramer. You know, maybe he's like just a little bit better looking and more put together. So maybe in a movie, if you're making a movie about Mad Money, you cast Stefan Molyneux. Stefan Molyneux was a good villain insofar as DP did a good job of taking down his propaganda and really exposing how full of shit he was. That being said, he just wasn't that interesting. I remember trying to watch some of his videos on my own just to get a better feel for what he was about. I have to give DP credit. They made this guy watchable, which was a hell of a feat because he just isn't very watchable. For Stefan Molyneux, I'll go with a C. I did appreciate sort of keeping track of what this guy was up to and what he stood for, but ultimately he just wasn't that entertaining, and he also never really had quite a saga because he never clapped back. There was not really a lot of direct antagonism, so he's not the most interesting villain available. And next up we have one of the true greats. That would be the Beast. I forget his full name, but I know his first name is Joseph, and he was the king of swag. I forget the thing he was against, but there was something that was very bad, and he said it like 80,000 times. So I guess ironically his new device that was supposed to aid our memories backfired, but at any rate, the Beast, I remember Scotty compared him to if you had Brock Lesnar with Bruce Lee on his back in terms of his level of badassery. But the Beast was entertaining. He would just make the same couple points over and over and over about how girls should lower their standards and date guys like him rather than guys who are actually attractive or interesting. It was kind of funny. His repertoire is very limited, but the way that he was easy to make fun of never quite got old. I really thought that it was a shame that he quit making videos. I think he had some pedophilia accusations, but he did get acquitted, so hopefully that means he was innocent. I'd love it if this guy would come back and make more videos because he's entertaining. And unfortunately, without the old crew there, it wouldn't be quite the same. But I think even the new crew could make some hay out of the Beast. Because the Beast was gone, really, or at least he left during the time that DP was covering him, he didn't get the interaction that I would love to have seen. I would love to see that guy go on the show. But nonetheless, I still think he's an A. The Beast was, well, he was a beast. I mean, the guy was amazing in his own way. And next up we have GMan. Now, GMan first came to prominence as a member of the Brett King posse. He's kind of a likable version of the Christian evangelist. I've been drinking tonight. It's whatever. Evangelist. I know how to talk. So, GMan is the likable version of that. And he tried to, I think, accuse TJ of being racist. GMan also has some of the worst raps I've ever heard. I mean, even as a white guy who is completely tone deaf, well, not tone deaf, but I have a 10 ear, so I can't really hear beats very well. I'm still pretty confident I could out-rap GMan. Having practiced never in my life, I'm pretty sure I could at least hold serve in a rap battle with this guy. It's amazing how untalented he is as a rapper, but yet how good he thinks he is. And he also has some of the absolute worst arguments about trying to say that slavery wasn't that bad, or that there's a difference between transatlantic and biblical slavery, that it's somehow morally different. Anyway, I've always found GMan to be fascinating, and I love the times he's tried to call in to things like the Atheist Experience, and every time he gets his ass kicked, he'll claim he wins, and how he's willing to engage with Thunderfoot and JF Gargopy and all these other people DP would bring on to mess with them. So he's a great sport, and I think he's an S tier. He's sort of between an S and an A, but I'm just going to give him the respect of putting him in S tier just because GMan always was such a good sport. And I remember watching that Atheist Own rap video and just laughing at it even after I'd turned off DP. So GMan still continues to give laughs here and there, and I forgot to include the people he interacted with like Shani and Rev on this list. I'm glad I did because they're disgusting. They would be, for me, they're like E's. I mean, I can't really, I understand why DP goes after him, but they're a little too gross for my taste. Next up, we have, represented by a black hole, True Empiricism, who was another member of the Brett Keane posse. He's a Native American creationist, and he also is very hostile. He has zero charisma or likability, not much of a sense of humor, so he's a black hole of talent and fun. And he also got pissy when he said attributes, and TJ corrected him that the term is pronounced attributes if you're talking about the attributes of God. And then his defense, of course, was, well, I'm Native American. Good to note there is a specifically Native American way to say random terms that are associated with theological debates. Seems like an odd word for a regional accent to emerge in, but okay. Anyway, True Empiricism for me, he's another F. I'm really glad he didn't come back. I mean, I'm glad that he had the little appearance he did have, but that was a one-trick pony at best, and all he was good at was just being outright hostile without really being funny and making awful points that didn't really go anywhere, but in a way that's not really amusing, because he had just enough competence that he could make a bad point in a way that was mildly informed, like Wikipedia level mildly informed. So not hilariously uninformed, but also not informed enough to be insightful. So he's kind of in that dead zone of just being, well, a black hole of charisma and life and intellect. And then there are two figures, two celebrities who were the foes of DP in terms of being people they all agreed were terrible, and those, of course, are Justin Bieber and John Cena. Justin Bieber, in many ways, while he is considered a DP antagonist according to the wiki, really he was more of a TJ Kirk, Amazing Atheist antagonist. Because I remember TJ made a bunch of videos back in the day talking about Bieber and how much he sucked. Those were all great videos, by the way. Anyway, yeah, Justin Bieber sucks. There's no other way to put it. He hasn't gotten any better. He's just become more of a douche over time. And now he's a very Christian douche, as if, his already existing douchebaggery were not enough. So, I actually still, I'm going to have to put Bieber in as an F. He's also shit. When it comes to John Cena, I was able to sort of bond with the crew of DP early on because of my shared feelings about John Cena. As someone who grew up watching wrestling, I also find it lamentable that John Cena was considered the greatest wrestler of his generation when he could only do 5 fucking moves. It's pathetic. I mean, if you're a multiple-time world champion, if you're considered one of the greatest to ever do it, someone on the level with Ric Flair and Triple H and Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker, and you have 5 moves you can perform competently in the ring. God damn. Now, because of that, I have a strong bias in favor of seeing Cena as a great antagonist, and also he's been more obnoxious recently with his apologetics toward China and bad movies and commercials he's been in and things like that. But I feel like Ben and Billy have taken a kinder, gentler stance against when it comes to Cena, and that's something I don't like about the new DP, is that they're not hostile enough to Cena. Just because new wrestlers suck as much or more than Cena does not mean Cena sucks less. It's kind of like the prequels. The Star Wars prequels were shit. Just because the sequels may have been worse does not change in any way the fact that the prequels were also dog shit. So for me, Cena is a solid B. Now, of course, he was sort of a passive character, kind of a background character, because he's someone who's on a different plane than, I guess what you call the YouTube celebrity sphere. And so he was someone who was out of reach, yet he still served as a unifying figure in terms of someone that we can all agree is dog shit. Well, those of us who are into wrestling. Of course, a lot of the DP fan base would get bored when they talk about wrestling, but I always liked it. And I really loved that one Raw is War style entrance they had, or intro. That was great. Next up is Wild Bill for America. I mean, I've seen enough DP clips of him that little theme song he plays at the beginning of his videos, that one's always ingrained in my memory. So anytime I hear the first few notes, I know exactly what song it is. Dong, 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 dong. Well, I don't know how to do it. Like I said, my ears as tin as the fucking Tin Man, but anyway, so I recognize that song that plays in the little intro where he has the title card, and then it's just him sitting in a park or whatever on his porch drinking coffee and then talking about some religious bullshit. So, I mean, Wild Bill's kind of like this mix of Christian conservatism and then just regular being a Republican in Florida. I think he's a former cop. He talks about being part of a biker group, bitches about how his wife left him. Just, not the most exciting person, but at least he does put some flair into his videos in the sense that he does have a tight presentation. His videos are maybe 3 minutes tops. So I do appreciate that he does have a little package and kind of a shtick that he does. That being said, he never fired back, and I would have loved to see him go on there and try to debate, because I have seen him talk with other weirdos like Trumpster Bob, and it's apparent that Wild Bill is not very adept as a debater, so it'd be fun to see him fall flat on his face. I'll give Wild Bill a B. I feel like they had a lot of fun at this guy's expense, even though he doesn't offer that much, really. He's not that exciting of a guy, and yet they were able to really do a lot with him. Next up, we have Jenny McDermott. She was an early antagonist of DP, and when they were starting around 2014, especially when you get into 2015, to me that was the high tide of the SJW, and Jenny McDermott was kind of like the poster child of what an SJW was. Now, over time, of course, TJ has changed his stance, and he now regrets going after SJWs as hard and ignoring conservatives. Although, of course, as we've seen, there were plenty of conservatives that DP was going after at the same time. But with Jenny, it wasn't so much that she was an SJW, although she was. It's just that she was a very unlikable person and very hostile. And so they didn't really mess with her for too long. She never really interacted with them. I found segments about her to be kind of boring just because it was just pure animosity on both sides. There wasn't a whole lot to say. She just isn't an entertaining or endearing personality at all. That being said, because she was a part of a movement that was becoming prominent and also prominent within the internal workings of what DP was focusing on, or at least it was thematically relevant, I guess you could say, I'll put her in E. That being said, I would actually probably rather see a video of... No, actually I wouldn't. I guess I'd rather see Jenny McDermott than Venom Fang X's attempts at apologetics or anything with true empiricism. And next up we have a man with a math degree, Ryan Wiley. Now, I miss Ryan Wiley. I wish that he had stuck around longer because he actually did fire back. He was petty. He tried to pretend to be holier than thou and above the fray, but then he'd get right down in the trenches and fight with DP. And he always brought up his math degree, no matter what the conversation was. And I think at the beginning of his video he said, "Hi, I'm Ryan Wiley. I have a bachelor's degree in math." I don't know, he was kind of pretentious and self-righteous, but at the same time, he wasn't completely terrible. He was kind of inexperienced as a YouTuber, but I feel like had he stuck around longer, he actually might have been decent. He made some good points. They accused him of being an SJW, but I would say he was right about half the time, at least. And he wasn't dumb, so I feel like he was someone who had potential. He just kind of quit doing YouTube, which is fair, because it's hard to make it, and there's not a whole lot of money to be made unless you really hit a nerve somewhere, or not a nerve, but hit like a silver vein. Yeah, so Ryan Wiley, I remember I just loved hearing them talk about his math degree and then seeing him try to pretentiously explain things that have nothing to do with math on the authority that his math degree grants him. That being said, again, the longevity issue was kind of holds him back a bit. I'll put him in the C tier. Like I said, I wish he had had a longer run. I don't think he'd have been an S tier had he stuck around longer, but I think he had B potential and maybe A. Or he could have become an ally in time. I think that he was, like I said, I think he was a fairly intelligent guy and not completely untalented, which is actually kind of similar to the next person, Steve Shives. I actually kind of like Steve Shives. I watch a lot of his Star Trek videos. That being said, I do understand why DP hated him so much, because Steve Shives is a very self-righteous person. He believes himself to be morally superior to everyone around him, and he also is very ban-happy. He has no interest in debate or discussion, and so he is kind of the antithesis of everything that something like DP was about. And also, kind of, he's against the spirit of the original YouTube, which is very much a kind of Wild West atmosphere where people can mix it up and meet new people, debate ideas, be kind of out of the box. Because, I mean, Steve, his whole thing was that he was controversial in his own mind because he sometimes uses profanity. Wow. So anyway, Steve, they did a good job of pillaring him and really making it out like his wife had cucked him. But of course, it's interesting because now I've watched enough Steve Shives to know that he made his wife look that way in order to create the image that he was kind of being cucked a little bit, although he wasn't. And then he left her for the possibility of getting with some other woman who was married or some shit. Anyway, like I said, Steve Shives, on a personal level, not the greatest guy, kind of an asshole. But his Star Trek content and his knowledge of Trek trivia is pretty great. And I think he's genuinely talented. Now, as a DP antagonist, just because he refused to engage, I'd have to limit him to the B tier. I think had he been open to discussion at all, he'd see that he has about 85 to 90% in common with the peasants, and he actually could have been an ally, but he had no interest in doing that, which is a little unfortunate because I feel like that was an opportunity lost. So, yeah. And also, it's interesting because apparently Steve learned that The Amazing Atheist has gone back on his stance on SJWs because he sees now that they're not really a threat and they're not really worth going after. And Steve says he'll never forgive anyone. So, yeah, like Steve really, I also have to say, just like Wild Bill, who's never changed his intro, Steve Shives also doesn't change. The guy really has not changed anything in the last 10 plus years. Well, man, it's not quite 10 years yet, but you get the idea. It's about 10 years at this point. And now we have Anita Sarkeesian. So I'll be honest, even as a gamer, I never understood the controversy of Gamergate. A lot of culture war issues are not things that I understand readily. A lot of them are way too dumb and petty. If it was about gaming journalism, which I assume it kind of was, then yeah, you shouldn't have people who have a personal stake or a personal relationship with the person making the game, writing the reviews. You need someone who, if not, they can't be unbiased, because if you're a gamer, you have certain preferences and expectations. You have certain things you look for, certain things you like or dislike. But you shouldn't have a personal relationship with the people making the games. Otherwise, you can't really write a very an objective review. But that being said, a lot of Anita Sarkeesian's thing was just trying to point out sexist tropes in games, which was very obnoxious. Because even though there are plenty of women gamers, most gamers are male. And I don't necessarily think it is cruel to women to have characters who are attractive or have big boobs or whatever. So I've never understood her critique of games. I've also never understood quite the level of vitriol about her. I feel like it was one of those things where she kind of has a point a little bit, but also her point doesn't really matter. And then the people who got angry about her point, I don't see why they're getting so angry about something that, again, is so low stakes. So again, this is just one of those culture war things that just got way out of hand and didn't really mean anything. For me, Anita Sarkeesian's an F. I never liked hearing about her. I never found her interesting. The only interesting thing that happened is when she tried to pretend that Ben was creeping on her because he saw her at a random game store or comic store or whatever it was and took a picture of her in Columbus. And it's also interesting, I lived in Columbus at the same time the podcast was in its prime before they went to Seattle. And while I did go to one of the meetups, I never saw those guys around town any other time. Well, I guess it's not that surprising. I mean, Columbus is a fairly large city. I think it's the 13th largest city in America. So I guess that's not too surprising. And I don't know what side of town they lived on or whatever, but still. I always expected, at some point I'm going to see those guys around town. It never happened, though. All right. Next up is Rebecca Watson. And I remember her being an antagonist of them, but I don't really remember exactly why. I know it has something to do with the gaming stuff because Rebecca Watson is a gamer and also a science creator. She's another one kind of like Steve Shives. I've watched her videos independent of DP, and I mostly agree with a lot of what she says, and I find her to be an okay creator. I also don't think she has some of the same character flaws as Steve Shives. She seems much more open to actual conversations and debates, a little more chill. That being said, as an antagonist, I don't really think that they had much of a rivalry with her or that she brought that much to the table as an antagonist, because she was not one of their foes for long. And I think mostly, other than on a few points of feminism, there wasn't a ton of disagreement, really. So for her, I'd have to put her in maybe the D tier. She wasn't the most interesting villain, although I think she's an okay creator. And then we have the Vigilant Christian Mario. And now that guy had a fucking arc. And also he engaged with DP. TVC Mario is one of the greats. He is, I think, the first crazy Canadian that they encountered, but not the last. So he started out as sort of a more refined version of Venom Fang X, who's a little bit better about preventing himself from getting involved in slanderous accusations against others. But then he sort of fell off the wagon. He became addicted to drugs once or twice. He had some definite repressed homosexual tendencies. So while he would speak out against gayness, he also apparently fucked a couple guys here and there. So, fun guy. And, you always got to love a little hypocrisy. Makes somebody more interesting. And he also had little clips he'd do. Like one time he wore a robe, I think like a bathrobe, and he's like, I'm a Pharisee. So yeah, like TVC Mario was a lot of fun. I always loved the clips of him because you never knew exactly what was going to happen. And I imagine he did have some sort of mental illness, whether it was manic depression or whatever it happened to be. But I always found Mario to be interesting, and he still appears once in a while. For me, Mario is a solid... I'll put him in A. I think he's one of the better villains they've had. He's not quite as consistent. He's not GMan in terms of his contributions, but he's still pretty damn good. He's a Hall of Famer for sure. And next up, we have a short but intense rivalry with Tommy Sotomayor. So Tommy is a black guy who makes his living talking about black people, especially black women. And he's kind of a real-life Uncle Ruckus, is the best way to put it. All he does is just talk shit about black people. There's nothing interesting about this guy, except that his scams are apparently pretty successful. I don't know whether he's getting other black people who don't like white people to give him money, or excuse me, other black people who don't like other black people to give him money, or whether he's getting white racists to give him money. But either way, he is making a fair amount of money, and apparently he also really sucks at saving money, so he'll move into McMansions and then have to lose them. So his financial fortunes go back and forth, and the second he has any money, he'll then go like blow it on a bunch of fancy shit, and then he's broke as soon as the revenue stream dries up. So be like the kind of guy, if he was relying on his YouTube revenue, which can be pretty variable, like if it went up 1 month, instead of thinking, oh, is this an anomaly, he'd be like, yep, fuck you, I'm quitting my job. So that's the only interesting thing about Tommy, though. Now, they did get a whole special out of him about his documentary, Fatherless America. I think he raised money for a documentary and didn't make it. I'll put Tommy in E tier. He's one of those guys I never found to be terribly interesting. But that being said, there were a lot of fans who were into Tommy. I guess you could say the same thing about Anita. But, yeah, Tommy was pretty boring. At least to me. Because, he's very repetitive, but not in a way that's amusing like the Beast. So, in some ways, Tommy was as repetitive as the Beast, just more successful. So, that makes him less interesting. I mean, the Beast never left his room and had like a fucking birdhouse behind him. So, Tommy was always by a pool pretending that he got pussy. And, talking about how he hates black women. Boring. Next up, we have somebody who is not boring, and that would be the YouTube user Nephilim Free. Another member of the Brett Keane posse, and I believe he is a young Earth creationist. He also, as his username implies, talks a lot about the Nephilim, which were kind of like giants out of the Bible. And I used to get this guy confused with Gorilla 199, who was another early protagonist I forgot to put on the list, or antagonist, excuse me. Because, Gorilla 199 faked his own death and got arrested for making like bootleg copies of, I think, the movie Constantine or some shit. Anyway, Nephilim Free, I cannot picture what the man looks like to save my life. He was someone I always found a little bit boring because he, in his own right, was just a bunch of bad theological arguments and sort of conspiracy theories. That being said, if you put him in a room with other people, other crazies, or people who were willing to debate him, he was open to debates. So kind of like with Von Helton, he's a sort of well-meaning, crazy person who works in a group. But on his own, he was pretty useless. So I'd put Nephilim Free in the C tier. Actually, D. I'm going to put him down in D. I can't say that he's better than Anita or Rebecca Watson. And now we have Devin Tracy, Atheist Rue. Atheism is Unstoppable. So, I don't even know exactly why he became such an antagonist of DP. I think he was the one who started the whole thing. And I think a lot of it is that he has certain standards that he holds where he kind of tried to attack them as being a dumb form of atheism. Because he would talk about, I went to Berkeley, I'm intelligent, I'm this, I'm that. And he also hates fat people. So, of course, he looked at TJ and Paul and had instant disgust. I don't know what it is with Devin. The guy's just a complete asshole. And because he has both talent but also no redeeming qualities as a human being, it makes him kind of compelling in a way. And then he also kind of reveals what's going on with him, what drives him. So he went bald at a young age, and that still bothers him to this day, and he's now in his 40s. And he's been bald for 20 years, but it's still something that apparently drives him fucking crazy. He also just has a very abrasive personality, and he keeps getting himself in trouble, keeps getting banned. He'll make the kind of 1352 points over and over and over, and just harp on them, and not let it go ever. So I just feel like it's fascinating with him that he is someone who claims to be so intelligent and yet just cannot find success. He seems to be constantly tripping over his own dick when it comes to YouTube and the internet in general. Now he's on censored.tv, which is basically witness protection for video makers. And he also complains constantly about people not sharing his racial views, and his views are outright racist. And he'll claim, no, these are just facts, these are just statistics, you got to accept them. I'm just going to keep repeating them until I get banned from this platform. But then, in the 2016 cycle, after nonstop racism, he then had attracted a bunch of Republican fans, as you might imagine. And his next move was to say, no, guys, if you don't vote for Hillary, you're a piece of shit. Hillary's clearly the better candidate. I'm banning and blocking everyone who's not for Hillary. So, again, the guy has fascinating views, and he takes very strong stances, never foresees any consequences, or just doesn't give a fuck about those consequences. I've always found Devin Tracy interesting. Again, he'd be an insufferable fuck, and I would never want to have a conversation with the guy, but he's kind of one of those guys I do enjoy watching from afar, just because you never know exactly how he's going to shoot himself in the dick this week. So, for me, Devin Tracy's an A. And there was a lot of back and forth sniping, but a lot of it was indirect, like he would do it on Twitter or whatever. So it was an interesting rivalry, even if it never quite lived up to its potential. But yeah, Atheist Rue is a bizarre person. And now we get to another bizarre person. And I'd say probably the most disappointing human being that DP has ever produced. Well, no. We'll have to reserve judgment on who's the most disappointing and who's the biggest waste of potential talent. That's a hard battle. But J.P. Gargopy is a guy who has a PhD in, I believe, biology from Duke. So, I mean, he's a very well-educated person, presumably has an high IQ. And at first, when he would visit the show, he'd come on as a guest. He would debate people like GMan. He seemed rather charming. He had a lot of fans because he has the French-Canadian accent. And then over time, it was revealed that he is, in fact, a total piece of shit. So the guy is a white nationalist. I've never imagined someone who can be smart enough to earn a PhD in the hard sciences and is also a white nationalist. I don't get it. It makes no sense, especially since he knows for a fact that racial differences by genetics are meaningless. So I don't get where his views come from and how that corresponds with his knowledge. He's also written a book which is apparently fairly well regarded, even if it's not a bestseller. I can't remember the name of it, but he's got a book out too. And not to spoil it, but he also is engaged in a relationship with a woman who has a severe mental illness, or maybe not severe, but she's got a mental illness. So this is a guy who's obsessed with genetic purity and with bloodlines, and yet he wants to reproduce with someone who has a damaged bloodline, someone whose blood is tainted by mental illness, or in this case, I guess, developmental disability. I don't understand J.P. Gargopy. And he also makes really shitty cooking videos now, too. But also just the fact that this was the only other person I'd seen associated with the show who's sort of on my level in terms of accomplishment. So at first I thought of this guy as like, oh yeah, so there are other people out here who are, not kids or not like dropouts or burnouts who are really into the show. And then he takes that turn and I'm like, what in the actual fuck? That being said, Gargopy is always entertaining, and while I'm not a big fan of Billy as a host, I do like his J.P. Gargopy jokes and the Mama JF voice and all that other stuff. For me, or JF Gargopy, not JP. Anyway, JF is a B. He's a little bit too disappointing and disgusting to go higher, but again, kind of like Atheist Rue, I just wonder how he became what he is. I'd love to know. I'd love to know more. But also, I'm not going to go to his site and support him by hearing him talk about white nationalism. Next up, we have one of the all-time greats. She's a great on DP. She's a great everywhere else. She was famous without DP, and that is Gail Cord Schuler, who I believe published books as Gabrielle Channa. So she has pretty bad mental illness, and she's driven by her trolls. She writes a lot of novels about Brent Spiner, Vladimir Putin, and all of her other, husbands in a celestial sense. Yeah, Gail's great. I don't know even what to say about it. If you don't know about Gail Cord Schuler, just type in Church of Gail. Type in Bubba the Black Jesuit, even better. No, she's the best. She's one of the best people on the internet. So her works are hilariously wrong in every way. Everything about him is fucked, but again, in a good way. So I had to put her in S tier. She's one of the greatest. And she's not really even a Drunken Peasants exclusive, but she's just that great that every segment she was on was great, especially the lick my butthole. So yeah, she's fantastic. No complaints. Next up we have Joseph Martelli. So Joseph Martelli was a Christian of some sort who, I forget how he came to DP's attention, but I think he tried to make some point that if all gay people went to an island, they would die off because they wouldn't reproduce. Therefore, homosexuality sucks. Or something like that. And they made fun of him on the show, and then he struck back. Now, normally when they'd have a random crazy, it would be a one-off. They'd never talk about that person again. But he kept fighting with them and eventually started making threats. And he came down from Buffalo, New York, or Niagara Falls, wherever he lived, down to Columbus. And I remember seeing him at the meetup and seeing him when he ran away, but he was posting threats, including having a handgun laying on a Bible and then recording that image while he was talking. So Joseph Martelli, that was the whole saga, and it was driven by one of the mega villains of the show. And later on, Joseph Martelli revealed that he had been manipulated in some way by the aforementioned, but not yet to be mentioned, supervillain of DP. And so Joseph Martelli showed up and then ran away and sort of apologized and backtracked. The whole Martelli saga was short but very interesting. And I do like that it had a resolution. And also I liked watching him get chased away. I was not one of the people chasing him, but I was standing close enough to the outside of the 16-bit bar that I did see it happen. And I think Tommy from the Bronx came out and started chasing him. That was pretty funny, because Tommy from the Bronx is a very muscular-looking guy. He looks like, he actually kind of looks like Tommy Dreamer, who's also a buff New Yorker with dark hair. So yeah, there you go. It's kind of being chased down by a professional wrestler. And so, of course, Martelli booked it the fuck out of there. I'll give him a B. He didn't have the longevity, but it was memorable, that's for sure. And I remember I was low-key a little bit afraid I might get shot that day. Just because I was at the meetup and I knew about the threats he was making. Alright, next up was Onision. This is someone I never really understood the appeal of. I guess he was popular with teenage girls. I don't know if he still is. I mean, at this point, I think he's my age. So I'm 36. I assume he's about the same age. And I don't know why he would have any interest in teenage girls, why they have an interest in him. Hard to say. But apparently, there was something going on there, at least for a while. I've never found him to be very interesting. His videos pretty much all suck. Not my cup of tea. That being said, his scumfuckery is kind of interesting in a way. And the shittiness of the novels he's written is kind of funny. I'll give him an E. I won't put him an F, but he was never my favorite person that they covered. And this is another one of the rare instances where I think Billy because he knows the guy, does a little bit better job covering him than others. But that being said, it's still one of those segments when it's on, I'm usually reading or doing something else. I'm usually not paying close attention if I'm talking about Onision. I just don't find the guy very interesting. While Jim Bakker was famous in the 80s and, has had an interesting trajectory. Also, by the way, in the 80s, he and his wife at the time, Tammy Faye, were sort of like the evangelical Christian left because they weren't hateful and they didn't really go in hard against gay people and all that. But since then, he's become part of that conspiracy right with his new wife, and they sell bonus buckets. DP's take on them has been pretty funny. Now, that being said, a lot of people have attacked Jim Bakker. He's sort of known at this point as an open con artist, so it's not really a hot take to point out that he's full of shit. I mean, there are even plenty of Christians who would shit on Jim Bakker. That being said, I feel like they did a pretty good job making fun of the bonus buckets. And I like how his new wife is clearly in on the scam too, so she'll sit there and do facial expressions, and his kids show up. I think the kids are by his first wife, and they'll also participate in the family scam. And they have these old people with oxygen tanks sitting around waiting for bonus buckets. I guess they need 30 years of food because they'll totally live 30 years if, a fucking nuclear war breaks out. Anyway, I'll give Jim Bakker a B. A B for Baker with two Ks, I mean. Next up we have Josh Beerstein here. He always would record in portrait mode like an asshole on his phone. And he raised money for the Red One. And then he'd ride around parking lots and make these unhinged rants. I assumed he used portrait mode to make himself look less fat. But it didn't work. But anyway, that's what he was attempting to do. He's another one of those really shitty sort of internet evangelicals. I'll give him a C. He was not that entertaining overall, but they did make some good jokes about him. He had one video where he tried to ride around a Walmart parking lot and talk about some sort of grand conspiracy. That was pretty damn funny. But otherwise, most of his videos were just generic Christian bullshit and apologetics, and it just wasn't very interesting. And now we'll get to a few of the modern era DP antagonists. So first up, we have King Cobra JFS. I don't even know where to begin with this guy. His story is incredible. Of all the new villains, he's probably the most compelling. And I don't even know if is he really a villain or an antagonist? I don't even know. I mean, they definitely make fun of him. He's got a lot of endearing characteristics. He's also got some less than endearing characteristics. Complicated guy, endlessly fascinating. He has to be S tier. I don't even know how to describe King Cobra. I don't know if anybody knows how to describe King Cobra. I guess he truly is ineffable. Too great for words. Next up, we have Jared Genesis, also known as Jared Juggernaut. So they've been covering him for a long time. He famously got his ass whipped by the Green Ranger 5 or 6 years ago. He would be S tier, but the problem is that he has outed himself as, to use the current terminology of Drunken Peasants, he is a PDF file. Which makes a lot of what he says not as funny. But he is a man who's the same age I am, or older, who still lives with his parents, has never held a job, doesn't shower, and claims that he is on a path to becoming a professional fighter. Even though every time you see him, he gets fatter. He also cuts his own hair, and it always looks fucking awful. I don't know how to rate Jared, because knowing what he is makes him a lot less funny than otherwise he would be. I mean, if it weren't for that one thing about him, he would be an automatic S tier. I still enjoy watching him get shit upon, though. I'll put him in the A tier. I mean, I still enjoy watching him get dunked on. And what's interesting, too, is that he tries to dunk on Cobra and try to do it in sort of a passive-aggressive way as if his life is somehow better. But I feel like Cobra actually has a deeper and more rewarding life than Jared. I don't know. Next up, we have Nick Fuentes, the right-wing founder of the Groyper movement. He is someone who DP started covering years before he became prominent elsewhere. Today, of course, he's well known. He's been on the news. He has spent time with Trump and Kanye West and a number of other people. He's an open Nazi. He's also an open Catholic supremacist. Just an all-out, unapologetic piece of shit. Before he became mainstream, he was about a B-level villain for me. So I think that's probably what I'm going to have to go with. And of course, that one clip that DP really made fun of and that got repeated when Late Night started covering him, where he tries to pretend that it's less gay to not date women than it is to date women. That was pretty funny. But also in general, just how he tries to pretend that he's not gay and that he wasn't about to fuck that cat boy in the one video is pretty funny. He's another one, I don't understand how he got to where he is. I don't understand how someone who's in his early 20s holds the views that he holds. It makes no fucking sense at all. Yeah, Fuentes for me is a B, I guess, in terms of being an antagonist. Next up, we have Trumpster Bob. So Trumpster Bob is someone who, well, as his name implies, is a big Trump supporter. He does a lot of things that I associate with boomer rednecks. So he tried to lie about his education level and height and all that. So he tried to pretend he was 6'2" when he's only like 5'5". Just a lot of little things like that. He also has an obsession with much younger women and thinks he's got a chance. He's a drunk. And my favorite thing about him, of course, is that he has the butthole challenge. He's obsessed with whether other men are gay. So he will challenge men to send him pictures of their buttholes, and he'll try to test to see whether those buttholes are blown out or not. Now, how you tell from a picture, unless you're a proctologist, I don't claim to know. But apparently Trumpster Bob has dubbed his challenge the Trumpster Bob Butthole Challenge, and he has assessed buttholes. I guess in a way it's not any more of a scam than like that VHS ranking thing that some people have started now on the internet. But anyway, Trumpster Bob for me, he's kind of on the border of an A and an S, which I guess is ironic because he's really into looking at assholes. I'm going to put him in the A tier, but I think if I had to promote any one of these guys in the A tier to S tier, it would probably be him. So he's sort of on the border. If it weren't for the butthole challenge, I don't think he'd be quite as interesting. His one takedown of that one fake karate instructor was pretty funny. But otherwise, he's just not... Well, no, it's mostly the butthole challenge with him. I think that's really what makes him who he is. And speaking of recent people, I forgot about that guy who talks about fucking nurses all the time. The guy who's whatever, the third. So he was missing. And then that karate instructor who went on DP to try to pretend that he knew what he was doing in the Trumpster Bob fight. He should have been on the list too, but... You know, not every list has to be complete. Who the fuck gives a shit? That's the name of the podcast, isn't it? Now, finally, last but not least, we have the final boss of Drunken Peasants. The guy who has been the primary antagonist since the very start. I don't know whether they cover him that much anymore, but, I mean, this man is probably as important as any of the hosts to making the show work, just because of how much entertainment he provided over the years. And that is Brett Keane. Also known as BK Wolfman, Brett Keane Hollywood, God TV Radio. Goddamn, Brett Keane is the epitome of failure. I think he's one of the most notorious conmen on YouTube. He's also got one of the highest levels of name recognition relative to his very low subscriber count. So not many people are subscribed to him, yet a lot of people know who he is. And a lot of that has to do with DP covering him and really lambasting him over the years. But yeah, the internet's full of videos making fun of Brett Keane or exposés on Brett Keane. And yet he continues to trundle along and try to make it as a celebrity. Now he's another example of someone who has some wasted potential because while he's not exactly overflowing with natural talent, Brett Keane does have the work ethic. Now it sounds ironic given that this is like a 45-year-old man who's never held a job in his life. But hear me out. This is a guy who will literally upload multiple times a day and has been doing that since the beginning of YouTube. And before that, he was all over message forums all day. So if he's dedicated to something, he will hammer away at it until he gets at least proficient at it. But at the same time, maybe he couldn't have been a big deal because, like, if you think about his religious debates, he's been having the same goddamn debates since 2006 with almost no real changes except that he's now on the Christian side. But he'll just ask the question, like, does God exist? What are the arguments for God? It is so basic and it's so limited. But also he's just a duplicitous, or as he would say, duplicious motherfucker. He tries to turn everything around on everyone else. He is caught in lies all the time. He tries to manipulate people like what he did with Joseph Martelli. He is a revisionist about his own past, saying that he used to be the most respectful atheist when he was actually the most vicious by a mile. And I just love those old clips of TJ and Paul pointing out all of Brett's lies to his face. I rewatch those clips all the time. You know, those clips for me are gold, especially those Brett Keane compilations. I mean, if I have to put on a video in the background to play while I'm, say, processing a video that I'm uploading, I'll choose those Brett Keane compilations because I want to keep that memory alive. I mean, those were some great fucking videos. That was YouTube at its absolute peak. And normally I don't get super into internet drama kind of bullshit, but with Brett Keane it's just different. And the thing is, like, if you watch his videos on their own, they're fucking unwatchable. His videos suck dick. But watching Brett get called on his bullshit is amazing. I don't know how it's possible, but it is. So anyway, Brett Keane is an S, and he is actually the king of the S tier. The manatee takes the cake. Move over GMan. So yeah, if anything, there should be a BK tier up here. But yeah, Brett Keane is the king of the villains. And honestly, I think Brett Keane has brought more laughs than all the other people put together. No exaggeration. And some of these guys have been fucking funny. But yeah, Brett, just by virtue of his extreme degree of failure, has brought more laughs than anyone else. And they even have a whole segment about Brett because he's that ridiculous. So they have the individual segment situation, or at least they did. Maybe they don't know. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the DP Antagonist. I hope you enjoyed this trip down memory lane. I was a little bit drunk doing this, but I guess it doesn't matter given I'm talking about the Drunken Peasants and that we're not talking about anything terribly important. I just wanted to get a video out, and I figured what better to discuss than the villains of yore. So until next time, this is WTFGAS Podcast, and I will see you when I see you.